Nicely done. No trouble. All right. Now I realized after last lecture that a lot of what was in chapter 3 of Davis, the reading for today, had actually been covered already in the preceding lecture. So I'm not going to talk more about Davis right now. I want to jump back a little bit to this question of world regions. I said early last week that we don't approach this class the way it's typically approached or is approached in most world regional geography textbooks. And I want to elaborate a little bit more on why that is using a series of maps from a book called The Myth of Continents. It came out 13 years ago. It's written by a historian and a geographer. And their initial purpose is just to say, wait a minute, this world regional system sort of framework that dominates or has dominated geography for a long time is flawed. So here's a piece of evidence in support of that. The 7 continents and their displacement in popular imagination. Here they're simply pointing out that there is a sort of strict way of defining the continents, and that's what the dark, heavy black lines here are indicating, in which it's simply a question of, okay, what are the boundaries between these terrestrial land masses, right? However, they point out, if you look at the way people actually talk, the way people use terms like Asia or North America, you can figure out from the way they use them that they don't always mean the same thing as those continents strictly defined would suggest. So, for example, when people talk about North America, do they always mean to include Mexico? I think it's fair to say that in a lot of cases, they talk about North America, and what they really mean is the US and Canada. Or maybe they mean to include Mexico, but they don't mean to include the rest of Central America. Belize and Guatemala and Costa Rica, those countries, they're on the isthmus, Panama, which technically are part of North America if you're thinking about it strictly as continents. And the lighter, thinner black lines indicate these more restricted areas. Greenland. When you say North America, do you think Greenland is part of what you're talking about? No? Or have you just never thought about it one way or the other? Yeah, there's that problem too. Greenland, from a strict point of view, is part of North America. But in fact, it's almost never encompassed in people's claims about North America or their use of the term North America. Sometimes Australia is treated as part of Asia in certain respects. They point out that the official boundary between Asia and Oceania runs right through the island of New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. Half of it is in one continent, half of it is another, according to the ways in which these terms are typically used. They point out that if you are a geologist and you're thinking about the movement of the plates, the tectonic movements of the continents, that in fact the entire island belongs with Australia. But it is not treated as part of Australia in most uses of the term Asia or Australia, right? Asia, frequently, you can see, frequently people don't think of Siberia as part of Asia. When they say Asia, they're thinking principally about China and India and maybe Southeast Asia. The question of Europe. Where exactly is the boundary between Europe and Asia? Why are they treated as 2 separate continents in the first place? They are, after all, one landmass. North Africa, countries like Algeria, Libya, frequently is not sort of part of the mental idea of Africa. Instead, they are treated frequently as part of the Middle East. And there are some good reasons for that. But their point here is simply that it doesn't map onto the continents themselves. And this sort of underscores the point I made earlier about the incoherence or weaknesses of starting from the idea that there are continents, the continents define regions, those regions are somehow coherent as such, and we can understand the world continent by continent. They provide this map which depicts the West, the idea of the West, in different uses, different moments in time. The West is the area encompassed by the dark black line in each of these maps. And you start up with map number 1. There are historical documents in which the West basically includes nothing but Great Britain. Everything else was outside of this realm understood to be the West. Later, it came to include France and the Netherlands, as well as Great Britain. So that was the West. Later on, it came to mean Western Europe, sort of the limits of Christendom. After the conquest of the New World and the establishment of the United States and the migrations associated with the colonial period, it came to mean the US, Canada, Western Europe, and other places dominated by descendants of Europeans. Australia was part of it. The Philippines came to be understood as part of the West at that point in time. Later on, there are uses of it in which it encompasses basically everywhere there are European democratic liberal governments. And you can see that it comes to include sort of everything other than Africa and Asia. There are uses of the West in which it includes everyone, all the parts of the world in which the people there look to Jerusalem and or Mecca as the sort of religious center point. So all of Christendom and all of the Islamic world are treated as the West. And those people who do not adhere to those religions are somehow not the West. And that's what map number 6 depicts. And then map number 7 is perhaps the final logical extreme. And this is the West in which the entire world is the West. And how would that possibly be? Any idea? This is a variant on a sort of Cold War idea, in which basically the whole world is ruled in one way or another by the United States and the Soviet Union. And the ideologies of those political systems can be traced to the West, right? So they can be traced to European ideas about democracy, capitalism, communism, that kind of thing. And the West basically is everything in the world except Antarctica. This is just intended to suggest how fluid or fungible, malleable these concepts are. Here we have the East, or the Orient, which is, of course, the opposite of the West. It's the other against which the West is defined at different points in time. And it starts out as limited to what we now call the Middle East, and it expands in various ways over time to include or exclude parts of the world based on a sort of mishmash of underlying criteria or principles. Note that the whole basic choice of terminology in the first place, West versus East, assumes that you're looking at the world from a particular point of view, right? Which happens to be roughly London, right? So that the West is anything west of London, or roughly in that kind of sphere of influence or orbit. The East is that which is east of London. And we talk about the Near East, the Far East, that is to say, east but near to London versus east but far from London. Right? There is a Eurocentrism to these categories that is worth questioning or criticizing. Arnold Toynbee, a famous historian, wrote a magisterial 6-volume work in the early to mid-20th century, trying to sort of tell the grand sweeping history of the world's civilizations. As of about 1952, this is the way he regionalized the world. And you'll see that the West here includes all the Americas plus Australia and the Philippines. Any idea why? Does that make sense? I mean, it requires that you sort of combine a number of possible criteria: racial categories, religious categories, political categories. The Philippines, of course, being dominated by the United States, somehow fall into this umbrella of the Western civilization. Eastern Europe he characterizes as debatable, because it wasn't clear to him whether it should be counted as part of the West. I'm sorry, West also including Western Europe, of course. But whether Eastern Europe should be part of the West or part of the Russian civilization was at that point debatable. Of course, it wasn't long after this that the Soviet Union starts militarily taking over many of those countries. Large parts of Africa and parts of Southeast Asia are treated as primitive, still uncommitted. They haven't decided which civilization they wish to be a part of, apparently. Central Asia gets divided up according to religious categories. Well, India is treated not as Indic but as Hindu because of the predominantly Hindu population there. Other parts of Asia are characterized as Indic independently of the actual makeup of the population there when you start looking at the breakdown between Muslim and non-Muslim populations there, that kind of thing. This is the standard world regions as of 1975, according to the authors of the book. This is very much what you'll find in textbooks of that period, to some degree even still today, although obviously the Soviet Union has fallen and that label no longer applies to that part of the world. And you'll see the dotted areas are areas that kind of don't, it's ambiguous. Sometimes they're treated as part of one region, sometimes they're treated as part of another. This includes parts of Africa, several areas like Mongolia in Asia, whether that should be treated as part of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Of course, at the time, the Soviet Union did dominate Mongolia, or whether it should be treated as part of East Asia, which from a cultural perspective would probably make a lot more sense. Those types of questions. And again, you see that, well, that poor half of Papua New Guinea apparently has no regional status whatsoever. Or it's sort of out there with Oceania, which is not even labeled. So they do have a positive message to offer by the end, although I'm not sure it really makes sense. I mean, after undermining the idea that regions are a coherent way of approaching the world, and they offer a variety of solid reasons to think that this is not really a very helpful way of spatializing your understanding of the world. Some of these include phenomena such as globalization, right? You can see ways in which patterns emerge or get generated in the world today that aren't geographically contiguous, right? What do you make of the prevalence of certain kinds of media or images and fashions that are that move through media and pop up way far away from where they originated in a way that's not continuous? It's not like you can draw a line on a map and say, well, everything inside this line shares a fondness for American sitcoms, right? It's actually very spotty, patchy, broken up. But this is the framework they say they use when they teach world regional geography. So they take the coast, the Caribbean and the east coast, northeast coast of South America, and they say that this is actually an African-American region because of the movement of slaves and the settlement and the dominance of those peoples and cultures in those parts of the Caribbean Basin and South America. And that is, they suggest, should be distinguished from Ibero-America, where you see populations dominated much more by the descendants of Spanish colonists and the mestizos and Indian populations that they intermixed with, right? Sub-Saharan Africa should be separated from Southwest Asia and North Africa. Ethiopia, in a lot of these maps, also in Toynbee, you see the Syriac. Ethiopia has a very unique status. Doesn't quite fit in a lot of these regional sort of systematizations of the world. And then finally, Central Asia, which they suggest should be subdivided further according to the dominant religious orientations of the peoples there, even as they also occupy a common region called Central Asia. Any questions about that? I would recommend the book if you're interested in this. And the reading for next week, we're going to start Crosby, chapters 1 and 2 for Tuesday, chapters 4 and 5 for Thursday. We will watch a movie in class on the 9th. I also have some pages from the Atlas to read by the 11th. And there'll be a math quiz in sections next week. We will see you next week.